Recording is on.
Okay, so welcome back to Pfx, everyone. And I know it's been a few weeks that I haven't been doing a lecture. This topic definitely, like the last one, has been a little bit tough. It's just the same kind of thing, like I said before in the beginning of the dimensions lecture. It's like the type of thing that kind of like hurts your brain if you do it too much. At the same time, a lot of other things have been happening. So, I just decided to do some more low-key meetings and greetings on Wednesday nights for the last few weeks. So what we have this week is a presentation on paradox, which goes really hand in hand with what we did at the last lecture. And I'm going to share my screen now. Cool. So this is a visual paradox, right? What we see in the cover video here. It's something that some aspect of it doesn't make sense, even though you can follow it for different parts of it and understand the spatial mechanics of what's going on. But there's one or more parts of it that are inconsistent, and yet they are existing, in the same image. So that's the basic, definition of what we're going to talk about as paradox. So just to give a recap of how this links in with the last lecture, we talked about dimensions in the last lecture. So how there are tons and tons of different dimensions, whether you're talking about it in sort of the New Age spiritual sense or the physics, in quantum mechanics sense. There's different camps, obviously, right? And one of them believes in consciousness and reckons with it, and the other tends to not. But there are also schools of thought that do allow for both of those approaches to exist. So we in particular are concerned about consciousness because we're talking about psychic phenomena and how to use them. Can someone please mute themselves if they came in and aren't muted? So consciousness determines which probability distributions collapse into the dimension that we perceive as our reality at any given time, right? So we defined dimensions as like a game or a level of a game that we exist in, and the dimensions beyond that to contain the possibilities that then get rendered into our dimension or what we are viewing, depending on the quality of our consciousness. So there are definitely, people have defined around 10 or 11 dimensions, but many can argue that there are also, a multitude of dimensions within those dimensions, and one of those dimensions is infinity, and the one after it, or the one next to one two after it, is like multiple infinities. So it's a very vast. It's really just a conceptual tool, and the dimensions themselves really only exist as concepts until we do the work of sort of building our rational knowledge to be able to contain the information from a higher dimension. And they also, in the case of flatland, for example, like we talked about before, we know that there are at least 3 dimensions of space. But if you imagine yourself as living in 2-dimensional space, as we do in flatland, and first conceiving of 3-dimensional space, you can see how when you're thinking about the dimension that's higher than yours, you might not believe in it at first, and you might not know very much about it at first, and you might not, even accept that it's real at first. So that's just something to consider as we're constantly, this skill set that we're building in this community is really about really constantly investigating and reevaluating what we believe and what we consider to be real. So last time we talked about Niels Bohr, who created a really influential model of the structure of an atom and subatomic particles, and his quote that everything we call real is made of things that cannot be regarded as real. So, atoms are supposedly the building blocks of all existence, and yet it's hard to prove that they're actually real. And going into this class, I wanted to pull a very famous quote from Lewis Carroll's novel. If I had a world of my own, everything would be nonsense. Nothing would be what it is because everything would be what it isn't. So this is, in a way, like, I mean, it depends on what you really think of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. I think it's actually, I mean, there's a whole world of controversy around this figure as well, and the context of this novel. But I feel like one of the lessons from that novel is sort of how porous the barrier is between dream and reality, or between, a psychedelic space and a material space. And, it's almost as if we do live in Wonderland sometimes, and if we do live in this world of Alice's imagination. Because, from what we've figured out with quantum mechanics, nothing is what it is and everything is kind of what it isn't. And that's really like fundamental to our existence and our reality, our experience of it. So Lewis Carroll, I also like to bring up because he was a mathematics don at Oxford University in, I think, the 1890s. Are you guys not seeing the presentation?
Well, I see the cover page. Oh, there, it's working.
Okay, now do you see the slides?
Yeah, yep.
So, okay, I guess I just can't go into full screen slideshow. Whatever, I'll just keep it this way. So yeah, this is where, sorry, this is where I was at. These are the quotes I was just discussing. And here's Lewis Carroll's Symbolic Logic. So in around 1896, he published a book on mathematics and mathematical logic. This is usually traced to Aristotle. The way, that in philosophy, classical philosophy, I mean, I don't want to say we, because I've never really subscribed to the whole like paradigm of Western academic philosophy, but when you're concerned with thoughts and following them, it's useful to use symbols, and it's useful to use the language of mathematics to sort of simplify arguments and clarify what they are and make them cleaner, more streamlined. So Lewis Carroll, wrote this really fantastical novel about Alice in Wonderland. And he was also a mathematician. He was also a photographer and an artist, a really perfectionistic, psychotic kind of guy. But also very dry, and had a definite sense of humor. And he himself, I feel, really lived this, that particular paradox of this like sort of left brain versus right brain type of person. And this is an example from his book, Symbolic Logic. So this is a syllogism, right, which has usually like two premises. That story of yours about your once meeting the sea serpent always sets me off yawning. I never yawn unless I'm listening to something totally devoid of interest. Okay, so in Symbolic Logic, he proposes a system of visuals and symbols that can represent arguments. So the premise is the first one is the story about the sea serpent always sets me off yawning. And then on the right side, you have I never yawn unless something is devoid of interest. So you can kind of see how the outside box is more for a certain type of condition, and the inside box is for another type of condition, and how they're arranged with each other. And then when you combine the premises, you get this, which is pretty intuitive, right? And so when you come to a conclusion, that story of yours about your once meeting the sea serpent is totally devoid of interest. So this is just an example of how we can sort of translate certain thoughts and arguments into a visual representation that can then help us make sense of it. Or if it doesn't make any sense, then it'll help us see that really clearly, right? So there's a lot of different forms of logic and schools of thought, and just like sets of definitions and rules, but they all mainly are similar to each other in general. They just look different because they are deciding to translate differently. There's often parts of logical arguments that are considered to be intuitive, and those are usually the things that you start with. The assumption that like P equals P, something is itself, or it is also not itself, or it is things like that, as opposed to what is deduced, which come in these later laws that you see, the more complicated formulas. The reason I want to go into this is because there are just so many paradoxes, and some of them are more helpful than others to think about, and a lot of them really are kind of dead ends. And what it does is it really trains your logical mind to a point where it teaches you what its limitations are. So if you can really break down the elements of what makes a logical statement, or what makes consistent arguments or a consistent picture, then you'll have a better idea of what makes something paradoxical and what is actually a thought experiment that's helping you to put down the logic and to strengthen instead what is left, the intuition. And also by looking at paradoxes, you can end up re-educating your intuition and questioning what are the things that you take for granted and what are the things that you assume are intuitive or common sense, but may actually not be. So there's so many different things. This is just something that's like, if you do Kung Fu or if you do Wing Chun, like you practice against a wooden dummy. Like paradoxes are thought experiments that strengthen your mind. At the same time, they strengthen your ability to go beyond the mind, which is where all this more intuitive, subconscious, psychic information is going to come out. So yeah, in formal logic, we have premises, which make up arguments. They are also composed of subjects and predicates. You have things, they have attributes, you have ways that those things are classified and categorized, and those are things we can see, symbolized in things like Venn diagrams, how they relate to each other. These are all things that you can create these symbolic sentences or pictures to represent. You have conditional statements like if this, then that, or this is not that, or you have also degrees of universality. If you say like, no circles are squares, or all squares are squares, or some rectangles are squares. There are different degrees, like depending on the argument you're trying to make, you can use different types of categories, like universal versus particular, to describe that thing. and to try to come up with more and more just like accurate, objective statements that you're then building into an argument. So this is basic, you know, there's a lot of this that is obviously common sense, and we know all these things. We know what a good argument is for the most part. If we're rational people and, you know, we converse with each other, we would debate with each other, and you know, we have to go about everyday life always coming to different conclusions based on deduction combined with intuition. But I just find that learning that there's a whole school of it's you know, it's kind of a mathematical subject of what creates a strong argument or something that is, you know, able to be considered true. Um, that really changed a lot for me. Like when I was in college, I took a logic class. Um, it's just weird because we don't really we don't talk about symbolic logic or mathematical logic in everyday life, but I really think it's something that more people should play with, and think about, and do this game of logic, like Lewis Carroll's book. Where did I put it? And I found, I don't know if you can still see my camera, but it's a double published, it's a double book with the symbolic logic and the game of logic. So he kind of teaches you the system and then shows you all these games you can play with it and play with other people, and kind of tries to turn it into something that is not just an academic subject, but something that, you know, children can play with, and that is, you know, will help you build a certain mental fortitude or a mental recreational activity, um, and benefit from it in a lot of ways. Um, I really recommend that book, but there's so many, you know, they're all going to be a little bit dry, and for me, like, sort of, it gives you a certain type of pain. I don't know if I'm the only one, but but to really break down things that seem so intuitive, and really scrutinize them and to their smallest parts of what is true and how to organize them, um, it does a lot. So this is from his preface. He says, mental recreation is a thing that we, all of us, need for our mental health. And you may get much healthy enjoyment, no doubt, from games such as backgammon, chess, and the new game Halma. I don't know what that is. But after all, when you've made yourself a first-rate player at any of these games, you have nothing real to show for it as a result. You enjoyed the game and the victory, no doubt, at the time, but you have no result that you can treasure up and get real good out of. And all the while you have been leaving unexplored a perfect mine of wealth. Once master the machinery of symbolic logic, and you have a mental occupation always at hand of absorbing interest, and one that will be of real use to you in any subject you may take up. It'll give you clearness of thought, the ability to see your way through a puzzle, the habit of arranging your ideas in an orderly and get-atable form, and more valuable than all, the power to detect fallacies and to tear to pieces the flimsy illogical arguments which you will so continually encounter in books, newspapers, speeches, and even sermons, and which so easily delude those who have never taken the trouble to master this fascinating art. Try it, and that's all I ask of you, he says. So, you know, it's not even just people who have never taken the trouble to. It's like, this is not taught to people. This is not, it's something that, you know, this comes from Victorian society. Is obviously something that has been gatekept. So I really want to encourage, just, you know, it might seem kind of stupid or like a waste of time, but I think that there's a lot to learn, even about just the little thing, like the ways that you might bicker with people, um, or communicate in like everyday life. I think getting really into logic is, it opens up a lot of dimensions for you. Um, And, you know, this is also, symbolic logic is really often used in game theory and computer programming and computer science, like theoretical computer science. So it's something that, you know, if we were talking about mind as machine last time, and programming that machine, programming that computer that produces our experience, um, this is something that will really help you when you get down to those like nitty gritty healing and rewriting the narrative of you know, your whole thing, which it's not always just about rewriting, you know, on a whim, but it's about allowing this spiritual essence and spiritual being to sort of arise from the state that you're in, which is usually just so clouded and just filled with thoughts. And sometimes those thoughts like contradict each other, and then if they're not resolved, then they kind of exist as a sort of barrier between you and your expanded sense of self. So there's another book called Paradox from MIT Press by Margaret Cowanzo, and she describes 3 different kinds of paradoxes. 1, a set of inconsistent statements in which each statement seems true. 2, an argument with seemingly good assumptions, seemingly fine reasoning, but an obviously false conclusion. Or 3, an unacceptable conclusion derived from seemingly good premises using seemingly good reasoning. Okay, so then this is an image from M.C. Escher, obviously. It's an impossible structure, kind of like the one we saw on the very first page. So Cowanzo definitely starts off the book with talking about how there is an intuitive basis upon which logic works and upon which you will find paradox. There's also a really interesting way that she talks about belief and subjective probability as being very new to the field of, you know, I guess there's a field of people talking about paradox. It's like a really like stuffy book, but it's from like 2005. No, I think it's actually like 2015. Yeah, because she's talking. It's really interesting how short-sighted the writing is. Like it was out. That was the time that I was working in a bookstore too, and like serving like Columbia University, and I don't know. It's like it has that and really annoying energy of like liberal academia, but it does bring into account, you know, the fact that people have been studying paradox as a part of philosophical study and a logical study for a long time. But something that's very new in the field is in alignment with something that you know happened in quantum physics, where we're talking about consciousness and belief. They've been taking that into account and talking about subjective probability as a new factor in how you can talk about paradoxes and how you can work out certain scenarios. So she says that there are essentially 6 different ways of solving paradoxes, which I'm not really that concerned about, because I don't think that I think that's a really like colonizer and like capitalist way of looking at paradoxes. I don't think that the aim should necessarily be to solve them. So I'm not really going to go into them, but they are called, and you can kind of guess what they mean by the names. They're called preemptive strike, odd guy out, you can't get there from here, it's all good, the detour, and facing the music. So these are all like different ways that one can respond to a paradox, you know, in trying to solve it or in having solved it, or that they might be this, they are the solutions. So you can see with this cube here that I actually also included in the last lecture, this is a 5-dimensional representation of a cube in which you're seeing multiple timelines, multiple like existences or paths through time that this shape is moving through. And you know, the perspective that we're looking at it, we can see all of them, and you can jump from one perspective to another very quickly because it's all represented there. You can see here, you know, when you're looking at it from this view, it's not really a paradox. I mean, it is, but you can decide, like the number 4, it's all good. You know, you see everything and they all kind of make sense because we're looking at it from this perspective. But imagine you were inside this cube, or, you know, at the point on the very bottom left. you know, your view might be that you can't get there from here, you know, or your view might be that I don't know, you're the odd guy out. I'm not sure if that really makes sense, but I'm just kind of making fun of her. Anyway, it's a lot of different ways to basically try to reconcile something, because paradoxes make you go into a state of cognitive dissonance, right? Because your mind is trying to digest something that is contradicting itself. And I'm not really concerned with this. Like I want to, you know, summarize what she's presenting, but also that, like, I see that there's a toxic aspect to the way that a lot of people will talk about paradox, and I don't think it should really just be like the whole topic should just be relegated to those people's ways of thinking about it. Because some cognitive dissonances should not just be solved. You can't just solve them. Like, you actually have to go back and change the premises. You have to do something, you know, besides like some kind of mental trick to make it okay. But there's something really useful in this thing that she proposes, which is subjective probability, and giving a sort of degree to how much stock you take, like put in a belief. So assuming that all beliefs are rational, you can assign premises or beliefs a degree between 0 and 1. So we're using decimal points. Like 0 means the belief that 2 + 2 = 5. So we definitely don't think that. And there's no way, you know, there's no probability that we would ever assume that and call that a you know, a viable premise. And then we have different degrees, like you know, and these examples are like not very good, because not all people operate on the same like adherence to rationality. You know, some people really do believe that God exists, like on a 1.0 degree, but you know, here it's at 0.2. Believe that Hillary Clinton will run for president of the United States again, 0.7. You know, like whatever. There's different degrees. You can multiply them by each other to get the overall subjective probability that it'll happen. So, and it's not always completely subjective. This is just taking into account this is just like from your view, using the facts that you have to deduce from. So, for example, you buy your friend a birthday gift online, and you want to give it to her for her birthday. And you know, you ordered with enough time in advance, and you have the tracking number, and you see that, you know, it's supposed to come in time for you. Then your subjective belief, your subjective probability that it'll arrive on time might be like a 0.8. And then, you know, because you chose something based on like knowing her really well, and you know, you think it's going to be a great gift, it's like, you know, in the right price range for what she might expect of you, the subjective probability that she will like it is a 0.9. And so to get the subjective probability that your entire mission here is going to be successful and that your friend will be pleased, she'll get the package on time, or she'll get the gift on time and she'll like it, is a 0.72. Because you're multiplying it by each other, and you're kind of factoring in all the layers of like uncertainty, and combining them. So, you know, at different points in time, for example, like there's a storm and there's a delay in the package, you know, your degree of belief in A here, the subjective probability that the gift will arrive on time, it might go down to 0.4, you know, and then that would bring the product lower. But then, you know, by the time the package arrives, then, you know, A is already 1, because you have the facts, you have it in your hand, you know that it's going to, you know, it's going to be in your hands. Then, you know, you still have that aspect of not knowing whether she's going to like it. So there's like a overall 0.9 if you multiply that by 1. So this is just something that I thought was really interesting, because of the way that, as a tarot reader and as someone who, you know, has practiced seeing and looking at probabilities, It does really help to just think of things as numbers and to have this principle of multiplication being a fact, like being how a way to calculate combinations of probabilities. And just applying that to real life probabilities and real life factors and events, and not just in a purely objective way, but also that takes into account that your belief affects all those events. And what Kuanzo proposes is that a paradox, you can basically apply this formula to different parts of a paradox to determine how intuitive the paradox itself is, and as well as the different parts of it. You can talk about how relevant it is, basically, or like how deep it is, because there's so many different things that are inconsistent. But it's not a good paradox, and it's not going to produce that movement in your mind that we're trying to get to, the perspective shift, unless it's a good one, unless it's like very illogical, because the parts that make it, seem like it should be be logical are very strong, and they're very logical, but then they still end up not logically making sense. So that would make a paradox very intuitive or very deep. So this is just my rephrasing of everything for our purposes. A paradox, when recognized, leads the mind into a state of problem solving. When we engage, the result can be one or both of the following. One, exposing a flaw in our own thinking, which then leads to enabling the reprogramming of the mind with a more expansive set of beliefs. Or two, encouraging the cessation of rational thought through exhaustion, which would then enable the intuitive thought to arise and new dimensions to be accessed, which would be more likely to produce solutions if there's a problem at a lower dimension. Okay. So here's an example from a very cool book of mine. I really don't know if you can see my camera, but Zen Flesh, Zen Bones. This is a compilation of Zen and pre-Zen writings and stories that are like oral tradition within the Zen lineage. And this is actually something that I flipped to by chance a few weeks ago, and it fits really well with this. I just like dog-eared that page when I look back at it this week, and it's a really good example where we can talk about different types of paradoxes. So it's number 61 in the series, Gudo and the Emperor. The Emperor Goyoze was studying Zen under Gudo, who is a Zen master. He inquired, "In Zen, this very mind is Buddha. Is this correct?" Gudo answered, "If I say yes, you'll think that you understand without understanding. If I say no, I'd be contradicting a fact which many understand quite well." On another day, the emperor asked Gudo, "Where does the enlightened man go when he dies?" Gudo answered, "I know not." "Why don't you know?" asked the emperor. "Because I have not died yet," replied Gudo. The emperor hesitated to further inquire about these things his mind could not grasp, so Gudo beat the floor with his hand as if to awaken him, and the emperor was enlightened. There's more to this story where it's just like a happy ending kind of thing. I don't think it's the most important part, but Gudo gets old, and as he continues to lecture in the emperor's court, and the emperor is enlightened, and he kind of just decides to like let him rest. And that's like the paragraph that I left out. But so the first question, this very mind is Buddha. Is this correct? And Gudo says he can't say yes and he can't say no, and that's a really classic, Zen paradox there, Zen koan. It's because it's yes and no, but then it's definitely like there is truth to that, but then there are reasons in this application, in this situation, in this reality, and probability distributions that are involved in the situation with this person, that like if the master were to say yes because it's the truth, it would actually cause the wrong effect. It would create a result that Gudo does not want, which would mean, you know, the emperor basically growing a sense of hubris, or, you know, thinking that he understands something that he doesn't actually understand, because it would just mean, you know, it would just be knowledge, empty knowledge, that the emperor would be consuming. But it's also not the truth. So, you know, obviously a Zen master is supposed to be able to see these things. So, you know, he communicates this paradox, and it doesn't actually help the emperor. You know, it doesn't answer the question for him, and he's still kind of in this state of running, in a way, like, or grasping, trying to grasp for things. And, you know, as we've talked about in previous classes, that's not a good way to actually attain anything spiritually. You have to let it come to you. So he says, where does the enlightened man go when he dies? And obviously, you know, that's not a question that the master can answer. And he decides to give up, you know, because the Zen master, like all Zen masters are, is like very confusing. He's just like, whatever. And that's when the master is able to actually transmit this energy to his student. And, you know, he just makes the emperor enlightened, if we believe the story is true. You know, he can just do that. And it's only because the emperor is in a state of defeat, because his mind has stopped trying to make sense of these things. And therefore, he's more open. So this is going back to this book, A Course in Mastering Alchemy, which I also mentioned last week. It talks about how to use paradox in a really practical way as we go about our you know, path to self-improvement, path to self-empowerment, etc. He says, as you become conscious in this fourth dimensional reality, many higher concepts of life become available. These concepts allow you to move around with greater ease and understanding. One of these higher concepts is paradox. Paradox means that what was true a moment ago may not be true in this now moment, and what was false a moment ago may no longer be false in this moment. Paradox provides flexibility to those rigid third-dimensional absolutes such as always, never, and impossible, and provides room for choices to be much more fluid and mobile. Paradox offers us more the possibility to release judgments. It increases our ability to allow what's in front of us to exist as it is without resisting or changing it. As paradox loosens up the rigidity of the past, the higher concept of allowing opens up broader opportunities for you to experience. Allowing is a powerful concept. It doesn't imply weakness, resignation, or inability, but rather it enables you to view the situation before you objectively and provides you with a present time choice to create a desirable outcome. Allowing gives you the room to explore possibilities and be fluid with the mistakes of others. Allowing adds ease, neutrality, and quiet observation to your toolbox. Okay, so this is the ideal, you know, context for what it is that we can get out of paradox. And this is kind of like a glorified self-help book. I would say it is also, you know, pretty concerned with alchemy, but it is also coming from a pretty white Eurocentric perspective. But I do think this is nice, a nice explanation of what we're going for. And here is a video of Bruce Lee.
So what I'm saying, actually, you see, I mean,
I wonder if this is working for you, audio.
So what I'm saying, actually, you see, I mean, it's a combination of both. I mean, here is the natural instinct, and here is control. You are to combine the two in harmony. Not if you have one to the extreme, you will be very unscientific. If you have another to the extreme, you become all of a sudden a mechanical man, no longer a human being. So it is a successful combination of both. So therefore, it is not only, I mean, so therefore it's not pure naturalness or unnaturalness. The ideal is unnatural naturalness or natural unnaturalness. Yin yang. Right, man, that's it.
Yeah, so I mean that's the basic thing. It's really funny because just as I started that video, my martial arts teacher texted me. Anyways, Taoism is another place where we see a lot of this training through paradox, like the works of Lao Tzu, the Tao Te Ching, for example, really famous for saying things like, the Tao that can be spoken is not Tao, and yet, it's saying that. So, like most paradoxes are, basically all the same. It's the one of duality, right? And it's symbolized by the yin yang. It's a very fundamental paradox. It exists on every level of anything you want to analyze. There's going to be yin and yang to it. That's just like the philosophy of Taoism. But there are greater ones too, and there are just so many like manifestations of it that if you really want to go through life, being open to observing that, you will learn so much just from being able to see that there are two perspectives or two elements at play of anything, and it really is a great tool for self-improvement and observation and understanding, compassion, all of these things. Yeah, but there are other types of paradoxes and a lot of more fun and I don't know, interesting ways to challenge yourself. I would say that checking out any of these books that I'm mentioning today will maybe get you started with it. But it's not hard to find them. But I just wanted to kind of lay out how it's something that is very crucial to the spiritual practice that we're talking about and that I've been trying to outline in these foundations courses. It's something that if you start applying it and spending your time really analyzing, breaking them down, and thinking about it, it will clear so many pathways for you to start receiving information and accessing different dimensions of consciousness, resolving a lot of issues and cycles, karmic patterns that are occurring repeatedly in your life. All these things like self-improvement, development, like opening your third eye and using the psychic information and intuition for various tasks and for reaching, creating things and fulfilling your purpose, all of that is very much sped up by spending some time sort of just wrapping your head around this and practicing with paradox. So to go back to Lewis Carroll, when he's in the beginning of the book, he's saying how it can be pretty frustrating to study logic or to really analyze particular arguments, because there is actually so much in our lives and in this world and so much information that we digest that is actually not very digestible. And there's so many things that we take for granted and assumptions that we make about reality, about ourselves and other people that are actually paradoxes, that are not consistent with each other. So it's good to go into that zone of, wanting to train, but it's also good to give yourself a break and not be so hard on yourself, like not obsess over it. But also like when you're learning and especially when you're taking a teaching from someone who's maybe laying these things out step by step, especially when it comes to logic, formal logic. There's so many small components that all work together that need to be very well understood as individual elements before you start putting them together. So what he says is, don't begin any fresh chapter or section until you're certain that you thoroughly understand the whole book up to that point, and that you've worked correctly most, if not all, of the examples that have been set. So long as you are conscious that all the land you have passed through is absolutely conquered, and that you are leaving no unsolved difficulties behind you, which will be sure to turn up again later on, your triumphal progress will be easy and delightful. Otherwise, you'll find your state of puzzlement get worse and worse as you proceed, till you give up the whole thing in utter disgust. So I just think that's a really good word of warning. You know, whether you're studying logic or any of these other things, spirituality in general, trying to empower yourself in general, I think it's really important. And, you know, any martial arts teacher will also say the same thing. Like, you really have to strengthen your foundations and repeat them and do basics as much as possible. So I just wanted to add that because I myself have been putting pressure on me, but I mean, nobody else really is, but I'm going to stop sharing this. I really feel like at times that I need to do more, or like, or even when I'm learning something, I often feel the need to just absorb more and more information. And that's kind of actually the impulse of what makes me feel like, you know, because look, teaching and doing this class, Pfx, like, is really a way for me to learn more. It gives me incentive to do my research. It gives me deadlines, you know. But I think it's really important to just cherish the basics, cherish what's already there for you, the things that are really simple, and make sure you understand them really well. And I've had to go through that, like, in so many different ways, like with astrology. I've been learning astrology, music, martial arts. Yeah, it's just really important to go back to basics. So I just wanted to include that note. If you're just like entering spirituality, I really recommend going through some of the stuff that I've referenced already, and the videos that I've made already, because it doesn't really matter what else you do outside of that. Like, those things are really very much designed to give you everything kind of in a small package. It's not that small, but it's a package. So that's everything that I wanted to share this week. And thank you very much for coming. I'm going to stop the recording.